on the Military Reports channel, and today we will discuss with you the situation in Ukraine on the 2nd of April 2024 year. A lot of things have happened today, so let's get started. Before we begin, I would like to note that today, of course, is a rich day, rich in various events. Today, there is a very rapid activity along the entire line of contact. The Russian army is advancing, achieving some certain successes, and starting from the really occupied borders, ending with individual cap building from various sides. Let's gradually, a little bit at a time, figure out what important happened today in the last 24 hours. But before we begin to consider the situation on Earth with you, of course, it is worth paying attention to the situation, the stalemate that is developing in the locality of Kharkiv. But today, we received news that, let's say 47,000 people left the Kharkiv region, from the Kharkiv region. In the last 2 days, there is a massive migration of the population from the east to the west, most likely due to the fact that the population expects the outbreak of hostilities in this direction. As one of the reasons, and of course the most important reason, is the lack of conditions for further life. Let me remind you that over the past few weeks, the Russian Federation has dealt many blows to the power plant in this region. The Kharkiv 5th Ch and the Zmyivskaya Ch were destroyed, and so on. Substations, power plants were destroyed or hit. But this, in principle, was not the main factor why the citizens of Kharkiv, citizens of eastern Ukraine and the Kharkiv region, leave this region. Probably the most important news, the most important reason why Kharkiv residents made this painful, difficult decision to leave their apartments, their houses, their property. This is, of course, the fact that at the moment and since March, the Russian army has learned, was able and difficult to find a word to finish off to Kharkiv with the use of FABs, which are both much cheaper than missiles, much more powerful than missiles. But these are actually two main factors: cheapness and quantity and power, yes. And here on these frames, we see the explosion of the FAB already in the city, in the, let's say, Kharkiv ring. At the moment, there are no obstacles for the Russian army to strike Kharkiv. Everyone understands this perfectly well. There are very high risks of simply falling under another such blow, so the population of Kharkiv is leaving Kharkiv. And today, for example, terrible shots were published, in fact, heavy shots. This is the traffic jam at the exit from Kharkiv, huge columns of cars. Residents are leaving in the direction of central and western Ukraine. Pay attention to the most important detail. This is what we see with you here: 2 roads and 4 lanes. 2 lanes in one direction towards Kharkiv, and 2 lanes are obtained in the direction of, let's say, well, to the central one, or there to western Ukraine. Please note that the situation is so complicated. The dead are definitely on the road, and it's hard to drive. So Kharkiv residents as a whole decided to use, including the oncoming traffic road, so that they can at least try to get out of the settlement along it in 3 lanes. Please note that there are no cars in front, that is, those cars that go to Kharkiv, at all. Basically, only cars that fly away from Kharkiv. We could observe such a similar picture in February of the 22nd year, when a special military operation was just beginning. That is, in general, the situation is as ready as possible for the Russian command to start a special, and to start resuming hostilities in this direction. Myrnyak leaves, of course. 1,300,000 people are not evacuated from Kharkiv in 1 day, 2 months at most. And there will already be here, well, only those who have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, well, heavy on the rise and other factors. Perhaps the families of servicemen who will try to hold on to Kharkiv here are difficult to assume, but in general, history is already turning in this way. Well, let's now move on to the line of combat contact. There are a lot of updates today. Let's pay attention to the most important details that just caught your eye. And it is worth paying attention to the increased concentration of drone strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine in the direction of Chistopol, Rivne-Kapani. A large amount of equipment of the Russian army was hit in this direction, and in general it is. First of all, this tells us that the APU does not spend its materials, its consumables, even in padrons, for no reason. This suggests, first of all, that most likely the Russian army has concentrated a certain number of personnel in this direction, and there is a high probability that the Russian army plans to resume offensive actions in the direction of work, to be more precise, in the direction of Novodanilovka, in order to cut, say, the main supply route T0408 Novodanilovka is worked, and go into the Afu groups in the rear, or enter the wedge into defense. Perhaps some other plans from Nestoryenka to push off to Novoandriivka, or Sherbaks, small Sherbaks. But on the whole, this concentration of strikes and pevedrons that have occurred these days suggests that some kind of offensive is being prepared by the Russian army. Positions due to the fact that a sufficiently large concentration of troops were of course revealed here, and in principle, it is very difficult to hide them. Therefore, here is such an interesting activity. Then, we are moving with you to the South Donetsk direction, to the settlements of Uglydar and Novomikhailovka. Uglydar is being hit again today, with the use of multiple launch rocket systems or flamethrowers of the sun. And we will stop literally for a couple of seconds on this locality, on these frames. I remind you that since the beginning of April alone, this is the fourth geolocation in this direction, showing us a fairly high increased activity of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. There is an extremely high probability that hostilities will begin or resume here in the near future, or assault operations. And of course, Operation Yugoldarskaya, a possible offensive operation. It is entirely connected with the result and the end of the battle with Novomikhailovka. As you can see, a large number of frames and a large number of geolocations have been published here today. Let's go through them in order to understand what is happening. Today, once again, footage was published from a different angle, as the Russian army destroyed the bridge. It was a pontoon bridge between Poroskovevka and Novomikhailovka itself, and saying that, after all, the blows were not inflicted by fabs, not missiles, but simply banal, they unwound this position with a tulip. Here are the shots from one angle. Here are the shots of the same place, from a slightly different angle, with a more understandable and pleasant picture in quality, all over. As you can see, the highway is completely cut here. There is such a place in the swamp. There is a lot of slurry, this water. So there is currently no supply of the Apu here, and it is unlikely that it will be able to be restored in the near future. Fighting continues in the locality itself. Additional footage of assault actions, attacks by Russian troops on, it turns out, the Garden Association Mashinostroidal has been published. The footage is shown, published by the Ukrainian side. There were several pieces of equipment there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of equipment. And then we understand what happened. Drone strikes, hitting mines, but in general, based on geolocation, we can conclude that we still managed to enter the partnership, while further central and even more so about the western part of this, let's say, quarter. This block, this part of the settlement, it is not necessary to talk yet. For sure, fighting is underway, for sure the fighting is very fierce, but there is no geolocation confirming further progress yet. We will keep the territory in a gray zone. On the southern coverage of Novomikhailovka, the Russian army is trying to expand the bridgehead, and a little preparation is being carried out. Artillery preparation for positions both north of the recently taken bridgehead and west of the recently taken bridgehead again. Here was a blow to the house. This is the main stronghold, the main line of defense of the armed forces. After crossing the Balki-Velikaya-Tarama bridge, and let's say a little to the west, here was the Russian army recently to take the stronghold. There is also a forest belt here, along which testing has also begun with the use of artillery and aviation. In other words, preparations are underway for a further breakthrough, for further offensive actions. It is difficult to say how long this preparation will take, but due to the fact that there is an increase, a general increase in the activity of troops, I think that it will not be delayed for long. It will strike as quickly as possible, in a short time, and then break through, strike and break through further. In other words, something like this is planned. A little to the north of Novomikhailovka, we can clearly see the activity of Russian drones, the Russian activation of Russian aerial disembodied vehicles. Here, the Beks are being destroyed, the armored personnel carriers are being destroyed, everything is under control. Supply roads and movement are also under full control. In other words, in general, the situation here is like this. There is a route 0524 to victory. there are small roads, possibly pontoon bridges again with supports located between Mikhailovka and Victory. In other words, on the whole, the picture here is quite predictable and understandable. Including in the western part of Konstantinovka, the identification of warehouses continues. The identification of the concentration of Apu, for which artillery is immediately working out. In other words, the situation here is still positional in nature, with small offensives, small assault groups, but which at one time provide a small operational advance of an additional 100, 200, 300 or 400 meters. Well, in any case, I expect Novomikhailovka to fall by the end of the week. Then, we are moving with you to the Avdiivka direction, Donetsk-Avdiivka direction. Here, of course, the most important events, the most important information, the most important fighting unfolds in a small artillery pocket, in a small package between Orlovka, Tonenka, Amansky, Yasnobrodov-Kanilovy, Prvomaiskaya Vodyana. This turns out to be the territory. Let's put it on the map with you for more clarity. This is where the real moment is unfolding, the biggest, fiercest fighting. Let me remind you that it was here that the Russian army used, let's say, the tactics of rolling, with the use of a large number of armored vehicles. It's hard to say whether something has been achieved, but now, well, in the first days at least it was difficult to say and draw any conclusions. But with each new day we get new pictures, new photos, video materials confirming that there really was a promotion. And the promotion is actually significant. We see with you that practically the distance from the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation that have already been achieved in a negotiated manner to, say, the same settlement of Yasnobrodovka, or to the Nantyumenskaya highway, is already less than 2.5 kilometers. We see a large number of flags with you, a large number of cartographers are painting over there are geolocations confirming. And most interestingly, footage of an attempted counteroffensive by the armed forces of Ukraine was published today. Here on these frames, for example, we can observe with you an attempt at a counteroffensive, with the use of several pieces of Bradley equipment with troops on board. Here they go to the contour of the blow. It turns out that it drives up to the forest belt. Here is this forest belt that we see on the map with you, where the most violent ones were held as it were. However, after the Bradleys reached the forest belt, apparently they transmitted a signal. Apparently they said turn around on the radio. Because there is a trap, there is nothing to do here. And most of the Bradleys from the attacking forces turned around and began to return back in the direction of Amansky. Although one Bradley, for some reason, it was decided to stop, perhaps she was hit or some kind of breakdown. It is difficult to understand from this angle whether there was a landing. And on the way back, one Bradley also hit her own minefield, and then an explosion occurred. And that is, fighting was conducted for this forest belt. And it seems that this forest belt was eventually taken under the control of the Russian army, since, among other things, the personnel of the 25th Brigade are being published. A separate one turns out to be Armobile. And here on these frames, we can observe with you a drone strike and a Pedron on an abandoned tank of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in these places. That is, at least to get there, we got there, to land the troops. Landed. That is, well, I think it makes sense to paint at least a gray zone, and then it will be seen what to do with this territory. In general, we see significant progress with you. The battle for this line is already beginning. Baranumanskaya Snobrodovka is not Taylev Pervomaysky. In general, it is obvious based on the trend that most likely the Russian army will be able to take this line, and in the near future. And that's where the fun begins. It is very difficult after the fall of this line, Umenskaya Snobrodov Kantala Pervomayskaya to build some understanding. And what will happen next? Here, access to such an operational expanse on the part of the Russian army turns out, whether it is the offensive of Snyatalev, Pervomaysky to the south, then Karlovka and Krasnogorovka, whether it is Yasnobrodovka, then the exit to the Karlov Reservoir. Here is some kind of settlement, some dachas, whether it is the attack of Suman on Novosolovka first. Here in the forest in general, in the maximum problems, since even just pay attention, here is the front line, where Russian troops will be able to hold their army, then the same Mansky snobbery is not Telova. Here on this line, let's say, it is on concentration, some shock fists can be concentrated along this perimeter. 9 lines, 9 kilometers of front, and the APU in turn will need to keep reserves, starting along the line here, which in fact goes around the whole story, and it turns out to be around 32 kilometers. That is, the APU will hold a 32-kilometer line of defense, and the Russian army will have the right to decide, if possible, in which direction to strike, and this is of course quite problematic, at least at a small operational level, to affect the ability of the APU's defense capability. Then, we move on to Semenovka-Berdik, where the fighting continues. Here, of course, today there was a whole controversy, a whole discussion, a whole misunderstanding, a lot of disputes on the web, and all from one video. This is the video that was published by Ukrainian sources. And now Ukrainian sources report that the work of BM Grad, BM-21 Grad on enemy positions in the area of the Ptynaya outskirts of Berdik, that is, according to Ukrainian sources, it is a blow of the Grad system to the positions of the Russian army in the village of Berdik. The place is located, 100% it happened right here. In other words, according to this video, it can be concluded that the Russian army managed to fully establish control over the Pur, and to wedge and enter very deeply into the defensive formations of the armed forces of Ukraine, just to wedge into the defense. And here they tried. There may have been an attempt to gain a foothold, and now they were striking out. But these shots were published by the Ukrainian side. When these shots were published, the source wrote on these frames that it is likely that the author, who made an addendum to this message, that strikes are being carried out on the positions of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, was mistaken. And in fact, this is a drone, a Ukrainian drone, that flies perhaps somewhere on the ground, removes a blow from the Russian army on the positions of Ukrainian troops, let's say before a possible offensive in the form of artillery training or something like that. And after that, they started arguing. Therefore, it is not really clear from the video. Well, it does not add up like a mosaic. Mathematics does not add up. How it was possible to break through so unnoticed, because we monitor all the progress, a lot of the work of a whole team of OSINTers. They're on both neutral and pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, with an understanding of where what is promotion, and somehow completely unnoticed managed to wedge in here, break through and gain a foothold. We also watched and tried to analyze this video, but in order to understand, so who eventually struck at these positions, the Russian side or the Ukrainian side. And the only thing that I managed, let's say, to pay attention and notice is this small frame. Here on the 7th second, I'm going to rewind a little bit now. Here, pay attention to this moment. Here, this is a hail projectile. It's not a drop of rain, it's a projectile of flying hail. Here he is, yes, here he is flying. And if you and I just tritely try to prolong the trajectory of the strike with a simple visual one, then we clearly see and understand that the blow is being struck from the Russian side, not from the position of the APU, but from the Russian side. They're in front of UUC Avdiivka. In other words, based on this, it can be concluded that the Russian side is still striking at these, in this area. Therefore, while we are in no hurry to change the map in this one, in Berdik, we are still waiting for more geolocations, more confirmations. I repeat, you probably have already encountered this news on the internet. All the famous cartographers have already updated their maps. But we are still waiting for military reports, because there are some signs that there is no progress here yet. It's just a mistake and a hype rush, they're painting over the line and so on and so forth. Well, maybe I'm wrong, but as soon as there is a more or less clear picture, we will immediately paint over, and show either gray or the control of the Russian army. In other words, this is the story that happens in Berdik, and in general, the fighting continues here as it were. In these frames, we can see with you another destroyed Abrem from the side, or rather, the ones that were hit, or who was trying to evacuate in the direction of the next one. It's hard to say whether he managed to do it or failed. Well, then we are moving to the Bakhmut-Artemiev direction, from where a large amount of information also comes. A large number of different geolocations. The most important thing, of course, is that the information comes from the village of Chazan Yar, if it is more accurate, from the eastern quarter of the canal, from here, and of course from Ivanovo. The Ministry of Defense announced back in March that the settlement of Ivanovskaya is under the full control of the Russian army. Although to this day, no geolocation flags have been provided anywhere on Zarechная Street, Zeleny, or on farms to the southwest. But according to the Ministry of Defense, if they are notified, it means that there is such information accordingly. We painted over the map, but today, very interesting shots with the direction began to arrive. For example, in these frames, we can observe the destruction of the bridge with you. That is, this bridge was also blown up in Ivanovskoye, the road that H32 leads further into the Yar hours, and it was blown up, as you can see, by a drone. That is, a drone loaded completely with explosives. And then the explosion, and accordingly, the bridge may have developed. Perhaps critical damage was inflicted on it, which does not allow it to be used further by the Russian army. But it's hard to understand what's going on here, but in general, on the very Yar, everything, according to, so far, without geolocation, without confirmation, without any information, that is footage from Earth sources. Russian troops have established full control over the last forest strip opposite the eastern quarter, a channel in this direction. That is, if we follow this news, we will not change the map yet, just for clarity, we will now put it on the landscape. This is where we see what sources claim, namely military sources. There are divisions that are responsible for the offensive. As of tonight, these two forest belts have been taken, and now there are no obstacles at all in front of the Russian army, that is, more than the same forest belts in the direction of the chaser. However, it is reported that in recent months, recent weeks, perhaps in this direction, the armed forces of Ukraine have spent a large amount of resources because they understood that in general it might make sense to build COPs. There are no trenches. They mined the forest as much as possible. It turns out the northeastern channels and all approaches, all passages, entrances to the Golubkovsky German forest are completely mined. This area is also maximally mined by the armed forces of Ukraine. And of course, there is probably a minefield. The minefields are located directly opposite the advancing Russian army. In other words, how the Russian command will generally break this puzzle, well, I can't say. I don't know. Mines are everywhere, everything is mined, and in general, the same fighters on the ground, who are more or less connected with the advancing troops, write that the situation is as difficult as possible. Mines are everywhere, especially in the forests. They are not just in the woods, they are in the fields, and it may be possible to see the drones of those who may have flown by. A map of minefields was drawn if the mines are visible on the surface, if they are fresh. And in the woods, it's impossible at all, nothing is visible. It's not clear to the poet how this puzzle will be put together by this mosaic, by the Russian command. The fighters and those responsible for the offensives in general, it's difficult to assume, but in general everything. The battle for the canal is about to begin from minute to minute, from hour to hour, you can start from day to day. In particular, information is received about the ongoing hostilities in the direction of the excavation, Kozyumovka, Razdalovka, so far without any frames. The footage is not published at all, only there are messages that there is an offensive, there is a call to positions, heights are being climbed. The offensive is also very well underway, it is very difficult. Again, no geolocation. Yesterday, we discussed with you that the fighting is being conducted in the area of the railway station Vyemka. Today, there are only small, let's say, responses, publicity, from what is happening now. In particular, the positions are being hit with the use of Krasnopoly. The positions of the rear in the Seversk area are being hit with Krasnopoly, just artillery strikes, equipment is being destroyed, and in general what is happening. Very interesting news is coming from the Bologorovka area. As you can see, we have already updated the map, and here, the Russian army is still trying to bypass this chalk quarry and a chalk dump located between Bologorovka and, let's say, the settlement of Zolotarevka. While it was not possible to take the dump itself, they stormed it dozens of times, and today there were shots. We will not watch them, but they are geolocated, which showed, filmed of course by the Ukrainian side, that the offensive took place somehow, and the last geolocation was recorded in this place. More precisely, the last damaged tank, which was filmed by the Sun, was filmed in this area. In other words, there is an extremely high probability that if they have already reached and were able to get here, then there is an extremely high probability that the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to break into this forest and tried to gain a foothold in it. In other words, this was the main task. And if we managed to get into it, and there is a sweep going on now, then I can say with all confidence that knowing the grip and tenacity with which Russian fighters still show their courage and combat capability, then if there is a task, and appropriate resources have been allocated for this, then accordingly this whole forest will be cleaned and taken. And after the capture of this strong point, in which, in my opinion, the 54th Mechanized Brigade is sitting, we can begin the countdown on Bologorovka. Then, of course, there will be an attempt to go to the next forest, and let's say these forest belts, forest plantations, and everything will be taken. After that, the boiler begins, either a forced retreat, or of course a boiler for the 81st Brigade. I think for the soldiers of the Russian army, I would like to arrange a cauldron for all the good that has been done in this area over the previous few years of hostilities. But in general, here's the story. Therefore, here, among other things, we are waiting for news from the Russian army, and we will see how the 81st and 54th are able to respond to the advance of the Russian army. There is no news on the South Kapinsk direction. A similar story on the North Kapinsk direction. This is the story that has been developing today over the past 24 hours. Very interesting. Maximum activation. We are waiting for more news. There we will continue to see how the situation will develop.